For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to Strat News Global. Sri Lanka, India's southern neighbor, has been going through one of its worst economic crises since independence. And the government there is looking to reduce expenditure on its employees any which way it can. One of the biggest employers for the Sri Lankan government is its military, which has grown in size in the first 20 years of this century, and now there is discussion about how it can be right-sized. Can it be, and is it prudent to right-size the Sri Lankan military or reduce its strength, is the topic of this week's Simply Nitin. I'm Nitin Gokhale. So, the Sri Lankan military, of which the Sri Lankan Army is of course the largest component, has been in the news of late. The Sri Lankan government, headed by President Ranil Wickremesinghe, has been discussing the possibility of reducing the strength of the Sri Lankan military from its current size of nearly 200,000 soldiers and officers to bring it down by half in the next 7 years. Is it possible? Is it prudent? Is what we are going to discuss in this edition. So let's look back a little bit before we look ahead. Why has the Sri Lankan military grown to the size, given the fact that it's a small country, it's a small island with no existential threat really from any adversary in the vicinity of Sri Lanka, which is an island nation. So if you look back, the Sri Lankan nation suffered insurgency launched by the Tamil Tigers or the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam way back in 1983. Given the fraught relations between the minority Tamils and the majority Sinhalais, which led to nearly 28 to 29 years of insurgency in that island nation, which finally ended in May 2009 with the elimination of the top leadership of the LTTE in the north of the country. That ended the civil war, but it left behind several remnants of that conflict which raged in the island, and several thousand people were killed in that conflict, which, as I said, lasted nearly 3 decades. I was there during those 3 years of what is called the Eelam War 4 between 2006 and 2009, which finally ended in May 2009 with the killing of Velupillai Prabhakaran, the chief of the LTTE, and the entire top leadership of the LTTE. The Sri Lankan Army won, but it won at a very heavy cost. Several thousand soldiers were killed or wounded for life, maimed for life, and finally the Sri Lankan nation heaved a sigh of relief with the end of the LTTE, which meant end of terrorism, end of insurgency in that island nation. But in the process of taking on the LTTE, the then Sri Lankan government, led by President Mahinda Rajapaksa and his younger brother Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who also later became the president of that country, increased the size of the Sri Lankan military, or to be precise, the Sri Lankan Army, and of course the smaller components of Air Force and the Navy, to match the requirements to overcome the deadly Tamil Tigers, who had almost become like a conventional army over the years. So nearly 400,000 soldiers comprised the entire Sri Lankan military by the time the war ended in 2009. Now, for an island nation with a population of 20 million, this was a very high proportion of the military. And yet it was required, as I said, to overcome the challenge from the LTTE, which was considered one of the most dreaded terrorist groups. So while the military was needed in large numbers in that period, Subsequently, post 2009, there were calls to reduce the military size, and over the years from 2009 till 2020, the size of the military has been reduced from the high of 400,000 to 200,000, which is its current size. But given the dire economic situation that Sri Lanka is going through, and all of you are familiar with the story, how three or four factors meant that Sri Lanka even defaulted on its sovereign debt. It couldn't repay the private equity or private lenders, banks and multilateral institutions, and even private lenders who had given money to Sri Lanka over the years. And it defaulted on its debt repayment, which became due in 2022. And as a result of high inflation and the collapse of the economy, which also was partly because of the collapse of the tourism sector, which brings in large amounts of GDP or large percentage of the GDP to Sri Lanka, the president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, had to flee the country as protests raged, and you are all familiar with that. So, after that turmoil-ridden period, when President Ranil Wickremesinghe took over, the government ordered a review of the employment numbers or employee numbers in the government itself. And the largest the largest segment which has government employees are the soldiers in the military, all the three arms of the military. And it was then discovered that nearly 2% of Sri Lanka's GDP was being spent on upkeep of the military in that small island nation. Now, in such a dire situation, such a dire economic situation where the government is not able to even pay back its debt and is dependent on largesse from India and from the other donors, the Sri Lankan government had no option but to start reviewing what could be done with the military, how to reduce the size, or to be politically correct, how to right size the military. So in 2022, the then Army Commander and now Chief of Defence Staff, General Shavendra Silva, ordered a review of the military, its numbers, its functioning, its units, and the details of how these soldiers are utilized in a strategy paper called Way Forward. In that, it was recommended that by 2024, the Sri Lankan military should be about 125,000 by 2024, which is next year. And by 2030, the size should be reduced to 100,000 or 1 lakh in Indian parlance. Now, a lot of debate has ensued in Sri Lanka itself and the world over that do you give time for the military to reduce itself over a period of 7 years, or you drastically cut down on the numbers within the next 2 years? Given the fact that Sri Lanka is going through a political and economic crisis, the immediate answer would be to reduce the numbers immediately. But it has an inherent danger. And the danger is that if you demobilize soldiers in large numbers, then they feed into the discontent in the society, and being trained soldiers, they also become dangerous for the cohesion and the law and order situation in the island nation of Sri Lanka. So therefore, the study which was done has recommended gradual reduction. So as people retire, there will be no replacement. Some of the units will be merged into each other so that some functions can be then consolidated. And the way forward will be to then make sure that only minimal numbers will be retained in the military, maybe even introduce short service commission for the officers and short duration engagement with the military, very much like what India has done with the Agniveers, the first batch of Agniveers or the Agnipath scheme, which started in January 2023, could be a model to emulate in Sri Lanka if people need to be given jobs and the profile of the Sri Lankan military needs to remain younger. But all that is right now at a discussion stage. No decision has been taken, and no decision is likely to be taken before either the parliamentary elections take place there in Sri Lanka, or President Wickramasinghe, or a new president who can come in 2024 can take a final decision, because it is fraught with many social implications, many political implications, many military implications. And many civil society advocates, civil society activists have advocated this for a long time, that the Sri Lankan military size should be reduced, because otherwise the society was getting militarized. In some ways, they had a point that the military, because of lack of real job or real need for deployment anywhere, was getting into things that are non-military, running some dairy farms, running businesses, constructing roads. In fact, the first wave of COVID-19, the Sri Lankan military was at the forefront of battling or mitigating the effects of COVID, and making sure that the COVID strategy in the initial months of the pandemic in January to April period of 2020 was handled by the military. And in fact, Sri Lanka earned a lot of praise from the world community for handling it very well, because the military was disciplined. It knew how to handle a tough situation, how to coordinate things, how to get it implemented. All that had happened. But the other side was that civil society was saying that the military was getting undue importance in a democratic society, and they were having a kind of a veto over some of the administrative decisions. And given the fact that President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who was president at that point in time, is a former military officer, former army officer, there were murmurs of protest, there were objections in Sri Lanka and elsewhere that Sri Lankan society, which is otherwise very peaceful, very warm people in that island nation, was becoming hardened in terms of how to respond to crisis, how to respond to any criticism. They were becoming kind of aggressive in nature. So there are both sides to the story. But the fact is that from 2009 onwards, post the end of the war, there have been demands in the Western countries that Sri Lanka reduce the strength of its military, because otherwise the danger of a democratic society being overwhelmed or overrun by a military attitude or a kind of militaristic attitude was being seen as detrimental to Sri Lanka's democracy. But all that hasn't happened really. The military has remained within its confines of the constitution. In fact, during the crisis when President Gotabaya Rajapaksa was forced to leave the country, flee the country, the military did not step in and protect him or prevent the protesters from pressurizing him to quit. That shows in many people's mind the fact that Sri Lanka has managed to keep the military under control and not allowed it to dominate the polity. Whatever the decision, whatever the opinion, the fact is Sri Lanka raised the numbers of its soldiers to the highest point possible because it was needed at that time. And now the logic is that now you don't need the military because there is no real existential threat from anyone to Sri Lanka. The number of soldiers should be reduced, and so do the paramilitary forces or the public security apparatus or the machinery which is there in Sri Lanka needs to be rationalized. Which way it goes, we don't know, because right now politically nobody is strong enough to take that decision. But the fact that they have started discussing, the fact that they have done a study itself is a good beginning for Sri Lanka, because that country at this moment cannot afford to fritter away scarce resources, financial resources, on a military which is not needed until there is a huge crisis in law and order, or in terms of society getting disturbed and some internal disturbances take place. So that's where I wanted to flag the background and the current state of the discussion in Sri Lanka. Of course, when it happens, we'll do another program. But that's something we do because we keep a watch on the neighborhood. We do sort of bring to you some different aspects of the society, the polity, the governance structure in the different countries in the Indian subcontinent. And it is especially relevant to India because nearly 800 Sri Lankan military officers train in various institutions of military training in India annually. I'm not even speaking about the numbers of soldiers and sailors and airmen who come to India for their training in various courses, various stages of their career. Of course, India will lose out in that sense. Not that India makes any money on their training, but the fact that there is a close coordination and close cooperation between the two militaries, Indian and Sri Lankan, cannot be ignored. And that's why I thought I'll just flag some of these issues. Of course, Simply Nitin brings you different topics, as I mentioned. We will continue to bring you different subjects and different discussions every Saturday. But keep watching Strat News Global, and of course, keep sending me feedback, your comments, which are always welcome, which gives us sometimes ideas, sometimes they improve my own take on various issues. And of course, do keep subscribing. Ask your friends, family, acquaintances to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And just keep sending the comments to enable us to improve our programming further. For the time being, that's all I have. Goodbye.